I came into the BBC by luck and chance. So as a researcher, then I became what was then called a production assistant, would now be called an assistant producer. My grandfather, who was 95, died, leaving my grandmother, who was roughly the same age, on her own after over 60 years of marriage. So it was very difficult, and I moved in with her, so she had someone in the house with her. Then she became very frail and went into hospital. The last time I saw her, she suddenly said to me, "Giles, when are you joining the BBC?" And I said, "I'm not joining the BBC. Why do you think?" She said, "Oh, I could have sworn you were going to join the BBC." And I said, "Well, no." And she drifted off to sleep, and I tiptoed out of the hospital. And last time I saw her alive. The next day, I got a phone call completely out of the blue from one Victor Poole, who said, "Hello, you don't know me, but I know you." I thought this was a friend of mine teasing me because I was not in work at that moment. Because he said, "I've been given your name and I was interested in working with you as a researcher on a history series for the BBC." And I said, "Oh, fuck off," thinking this was a friend. No, I really am. And we chatted on the phone, and he invited me. He was obviously used to the industrial language of broadcasting. He invited me to join him for lunch at the television centre to discuss whether it was a good fit for me to. And we had a marvellous time over lunch. It happened to be the day of the funeral of my grandmother, who died the very day that I got this phone call out of the blue.
Do you think she'd set it up?
I don't know. It is just very weird. There was nothing in anything. No one had ever suggested I'd work for the BBC. There was no hint. It was just weird that she said that, and that was the last thing she ever said to me.
So you felt in her memory that you really ought to join the BBC.
Yeah, I felt the hand of history on my shoulder.
This is not the time for sound bites, Giles.
Anyway, I've been recommended to the producer, Victor Poole, who offered me the job. He'd been given my name by a woman who had a better degree than me, who worked as a secretary and Victor was going around asking, "Does anyone know a good researcher?" And she piped up and said, "Yes, I know this friend of mine, Giles Oakley, you should contact him." And my whole life has been based on that recommendation. It's just incredible.
You said you came in as a researcher. What was your academic background? Was it history?
I did history, yes. History and American Studies at Nottingham University.
Right.
I started with a 3-month contract, which Beryl Radley, who was the deputy head of the department, the education department, she interviewed me, but it was mainly her telling me about her husband, who was an historian. She said to me, very wisely in a way, she said, "We're giving you a 3-month contract, but you must understand you may never get another one. There are no jobs for life in television. You're only as good as your last programme. You may never work again. Don't think you've got a career just because you've got a 3-month contract."
I think there are a lot of people working in television for whom that wasn't true, because you hear of a lot of people who sat for 18 months never having produced a programme.
Yes.
And they're calling it research, I suppose.
Yes, I remember that, certainly. Yes, there were some strange people who survived year after year doing very, very little.
Yes.
And what they were doing was very, very poor.
Yes.
I was a director before I became a producer. I went on a training course for film directing and another training course for OB and studio directing. And that's where I met my wife. So that was a worthwhile course to go on.
Yes. What year did you join the BBC then?
1969. Victor Poole was wonderful. He was a gay man, and he was a pretty out gay man. Decriminalisation of homosexuality, the bill of 1967. He was sort of, some would say, very camp. He had an incredible range of funny stories that would have people in. Some of the stories I heard him tell many times, but he never failed to make me laugh. I worked with him on several series, and people say that I was the son he wished he'd had. We used to argue a lot. It would get very heated, and people would think, what's going on in that office there? And we would be going hammer and tongs. But he always let me argue and try and persuade him of whatever I was trying to persuade him. And I learned a huge amount from him. Well, I was involved in union activities from quite early on in my BBC career, which began in 1969. For a while I was the chair of the production branch in London, which covered producers, directors, executive producers, PAs, and so on, all the full range of production. Many of the activities of the union actually crossed over into concern for quality of broadcasting, issues to do with censorship and free speech, and empowering the producer in a way that many people felt there was a heavy hand of management that was blocking creativity, blocking risk-taking. So the union, and I think it was in my era, there was an appetite for challenging the BBC at the highest level, ultimately, when it was felt the BBC was being too cautious and times not willing to defend and protect public service broadcasting. And we tried to make a fight of it and to challenge that wherever we could. And I think we got a lot of support from ordinary members of production, including executive producers.
Was that at a time when the BBC felt itself under attack from politicians?
Yes, particularly under Margaret Thatcher. There was a feeling that she was very hostile to all types of public service or the public sector, not only in broadcasting, but particularly there, because obviously that's the area, the arena where politics is fought out for most people. It's the radio and television. And so she wanted to curtail, I think it's clear, wanted to curtail the freedom of people to criticise her government. I don't think she really had a feel for, she clearly had a feel for democracy in certain ways and defending. One could say that the Falklands War was about that in a sense, that British values, which included democracy, were at stake. And so I wouldn't want to blanketly say that she did not respect democratic procedures, but I don't think she had a feel for it with, if you like, quotes, ordinary people. And I think that's where she wanted pressure put on the BBC to eliminate certain elements of the full range of broadcasting. And there was particularly a fight in the late 80s when the Thatcher government wanted to sell off the franchises for ITV to the highest bidder. So ITV franchises would be decided by how much they'd paid for it. And there was a reduction in the public service elements, which are mandated in ITV. They have to have news, they have to have a certain amount of current affairs, etc., etc. The way she was pushing for it, all that would go, and it would just be enable the people who fund ITV through advertising could make more and more money by having bigger and bigger audiences for, if you like, non-public service type of stuff. If that had got through unchallenged, that would have had, and did have, enormous ramifications for the BBC and the public service element of the BBC. The BBC would be the keepers of the flame for public service, and potentially would be in a fight with one hand tied behind your back to compete with ITV. ITV could always out populist broadcasting which would force the BBC to decide, do we compete on the same terms, or do we just stick to the, quote, worthy stuff?
So you think the BBC were being very overcautious, and you, on behalf of production, was saying effectively you need to be bolder.
Yes, yes. And there was a particular programme that I was series producer for a BBC One series called Network. Anna Ford, the esteemed newsreader, presenter, she was chairing these debates about broadcasting policy. And we did one about the franchise issue and the implications for the BBC. The BBC really did not want us to make that programme. There was a lot of pressure on me not to do it. And really? I must say, I have enormous respect for, I don't want to particularly isolate individuals, but here I would want to praise Will Wyatt, who would have been, I think, managing director of network television at that stage. I approached him, I knew him a little bit, and I'd always got on reasonably well with him, and I said, Will, we're doing this programme, which I'm under pressure to drop, about the implications for the BBC of the selling of the franchises for ITV. And I'm finding it difficult to find anybody from the BBC who will appear in the programme, which was recorded on a Sunday night and would be transmitted on the Monday the next day. And Will said, I really don't want, at the weekend I go to Oxford where I have a house, and I really don't. But if in the end you can't get anybody else, I will appear. But please try to get someone else. And sure enough, no one else wanted to pick up the poison chalice. So Will appeared. And he spoke extremely eloquently, and he defended the BBC and challenged the ITV people, saying you should be fighting for the public service element of your remit, because we had people from ITV in the programme. And I thought, well, full marks to Will. He is a true keeper of the flame. He understood the issue, and he was excellent. I really admired what he did in that programme.
Yeah.
One of the most important activities of the union was fighting against censorship and holding the management's feet to the fire, as they say, and not caving into any pressure from outside agencies of any kind, whether it's the government or any vested interest. We had to fight for the independence of the BBC on several occasions in the 80s when the BBC seemed to be losing its nerve, to be honest.
You're almost saying that the BBC itself was its own worst enemy very often.
Yes, I think it was its own worst enemy because the public in general supported the BBC when it was courageous in its reporting. And the staff would be energised if they felt the management was fighting for them. So it was extremely important. One of the biggest strikes or biggest union activities was about censorship, and that involved the Sinn Féin ban. And it was a one-day strike involving not only the BBC but ITV, independent local radio, the whole range of broadcasting. The Sinn Féin ban came about because Thatcher was, I think, in Canada or North America, and she got off the plane and was asked by somebody, what do you think about Gerry Adams saying something or other? And she said, we don't want to give the oxygen of publicity to people like that. We must do something about it. And so it was almost by accident that Thatcher was pushed into taking a rather extreme position, which I think she possibly realised she'd overstepped the mark a bit, and did ultimately, under pressure of the strikes and the union activities, and also people in managerial positions who had the guts to push the argument as well. One of the activities of the day of strike was having pickets round Broadcasting House, Television Centre and all the other. Wherever broadcasting took place, there were pickets. And I was interviewed on the picket line by somebody, I don't even know who they represented. I was asked about the strike and the reasons for the strike and why was I on this picket line. And amazingly, that evening I got a phone call from my wife's aunt who lived in Venezuela. She said, "Giles, I just heard you on the radio talking about being on strike." She said, "I almost fell off my chair. What? It was so lovely to hear from you." So there was international interest in this, and it was the BBC just somehow missed a trick over and over again. I felt at that time. Now, of course, some people would think all this union activity was really sort of rather earnest and overwhelmingly serious. But as it happens, one of the most successful campaigns we had in the union was one which was almost universally applauded, including on the managerial side, was when we won the struggle to have soft toilet paper. In the old days, you had to have that shiny kind of lavatory paper, which older people will remember with disgust. And it took a while, but the managers could see it was in their own interest to let us all have, proper, nice, soft toilet paper. So we were not only involved in pay and conditions, important though they were, but also issues of national importance to do with the health of our democracy and proper free reporting and so on. And we couldn't have important issues being taken off air by pressure from government. So just as the best union activities were when the head office were involved along with rank and file members, also the best activities were when there was somebody on the inside managerially who was often feeding information to us when we were engaged in activities. So to give another example of the success of managers, progressive managers plus union members, there was a quite notorious head of department this would be in the 1970s, who was known for sexual harassment, and this was a persistent and relentless activity on his part, where no woman ever liked to be in his office for fear that he would start interfering with them, touching them, and sometimes he locked the door and trapped them in his office. His activities were well known, and people were saying, "Why is nothing done about it?" It's a public humiliation for people that nothing is done, and yet everyone knows. There were even stories in Private Eye about it. So we compiled a dossier of statements from over 20 women in the department of examples of the way he had been harassing them and touching them and behaving in an appalling way. And we presented this dossier over to the management, and they said, "Oh, thank God, this really, really helps us to have this dossier. Thank you so much. We have been heading towards taking action about him, but this really strengthens our hand. So thank you so much for doing that. And please pass on our thanks to the women who quite courageously stepped up to give their experiences of this horrible man." Now, he was removed from that job. The sad thing is he then went to BBC office in... So he sort of escaped. With one bound he was free. But at the London end of things, at least, he was removed from the department he had been in charge of. So when people say that what was revealed by Jimmy Savile's saga, and people say, well, that was just the mores of the time. People didn't think, they just thought that's life. Women had to put up with that sort of stuff, and values were different then. I say that's not entirely true. The Jimmy Savile story notwithstanding, we took action over that head of department, and we worked together, men and women, say, no, this is not acceptable behaviour. Women should not have to suffer this in their workplace. So even in the 1970s, there were occasions when action was taken.
Yeah. I mean, that was a sexual harassment issue. Do you think BBC management on the whole was very supportive of causes and social issues?
It comes down partly to individuals, partly to the culture.
Yes.
I think that there are people at the managerial level. One thinks of David Attenborough when he was Controller 2 and when he was Director of Programmes, I think the title was. Extraordinarily progressive in the broadest sense. Not that I was there when he was in his pomp.
No.
He, I think, found that side of things, the managerial side of things, quite difficult. He was a friend of my father's. My father helped expose the Piltdown Skull scandal, the hoax, in the 1950s. And I think through that he got to know David Attenborough. And when Attenborough quit as Director of Programmes, Charles Hill, Dr. Hill, was the chairman of the BBC Governors. And he said, this is according to what David said to my dad, Hill said to Attenborough, trying to persuade him to stay, so why are you leaving? Well, you've got one of the greatest jobs in television that there is. Why are you quitting? And Attenborough said, I find it very difficult ordering people about and telling people what they should do with their lives and their careers, and it's not really me. And Hill said, good God, that's exactly what I like about this job.
The radio doctor strikes again. Let's come on to production. Now, you worked for education, but then you became involved in the community's programme.
The community programme unit, which I joined as a producer. And that became a lifetime cause for me, really. I was there for 16 years. And the succession of the job title would be editor CPU, and there was a succession of them who really enriched my life personally and professionally. And I would like to mention them because they had such an impact. It's not really important on the impact on me specifically, though I want to thank them for that, but it's about their contribution to broadcasting generally. All of them fought for the survival of the CPU, which was at times at risk. And sadly, I was the last one. I failed to pass the baton on in the way that my predecessors had. So I'd just like to name them. First of all, there was Paul Bonner, who gave me an attachment for 6 months in the CPU in 1977. Then in 1982, Mike Fentiman, the late Mike Fentiman, an inspirational figure, an enormous giant in terms of the history of the CPU. There's no one who made a bigger contribution than him. At, I would say, the cost of his health, the pressure and the stress on him in the 1980s was phenomenal. He's greatly missed. After Mike, there was Tony Lai, who I knew in the education department. He made a really good series called The Black Man in Britain. He's black, and he must have had more difficult... It's a difficult career, television. It is for everybody, but I don't think there's any doubt at all that he will have faced all sorts of unspoken at times prejudices, hostility, and I must say I admire him enormously. I liked working with him. I like working with all these editors. After Tony, Jeremy Gibson, who was another excellent editor. It was in his time that the video diaries and series really took off. And so there's so many people one could credit, other producers that all of us we worked with, and so on and so forth. But I really wanted to name those because they all had such a significant role in my life, my career. So thank you, guys. The most famous programme from Community Programme Unit was Open Door, which was the so-called public access program, where editorial control was handed over to groups or individuals to express their own views in.
Let's go back, because this department existed for some years before you joined it.
Yes. It was created in 1972. David Attenborough was very involved in support of it. And Stuart Hood, I think, and various other people. I watched it from day one. I loved Open Door. It was often very rough and ready and they had very small budgets. When I joined on Attachment in 1977, and I produced a program where it was on film, and film in those days was quite expensive, often the most expensive element in a program. You would have 10-minute rolls of film. The average allocation would be 8, a ratio of 8 to 1.
The shooting ratio, as they called it.
Shooting ratio. So the number of rolls of film would be 8 for every 10 minutes. The allocation for Open Door was a shooting ratio of 3 to 1. So it was very, very tight, and a very good discipline to have to really plan what you were going to do. Funnily enough, only the other day I was contacted by someone who's doing research on that very first program I produced. It's amazing. Just literally this week, I've been interviewed by someone in America working for a jazz channel about a series that I helped produce 45 years ago called The Devil's Music, A History of the Blues. So I was questioned for over an hour about that. I had a query from an academic about the Open Door program I produced in 1977, and I was contacted by someone else who I'd worked with making a series challenging the privatization of the water industry. He said, everything we said in that program in 1987 has been proved correct, and he pointed to the fine of over £90 million for Southern Water for their failures to maintain quality of water. So that's just 3 areas, literally in a week. It just shows there is an afterlife of BBC programmes that people really value. That it's an important history. And this project, which you're involved in, is important for that very reason. The BBC has been at the heart of so many things, politically, culturally, democratically, and it needs to be preserved and protected.
Now, do you think it's actually losing its way in terms of its commitment to what you might call high culture? I don't like the word. And when I hear the word culture, I reach for my dictionary. But there is a certain, the way in which, for example, this is just a hobby horse of mine, Desert Island Discs rarely interviews anyone who's interested in classical music these days. And that seems to be a sort of, it's almost an anti-intellectual, anti-cultural phenomenon, yes. Populism rides too high.
I think that's a live issue.
Yes. There were always a lot of quite powerful women in the BBC. I suppose because the BBC had to appeal to everybody way back in the 30s, that they employed quite a number of women, I imagine, in talks department and things like that. So women were always quite strong, the BBC, but it still had a kind of white male culture, didn't it?
Oh, yes, I think that's true. One of the things about, there were some very strong women, and I think that there was a generation of women in the BBC who, in a sense, felt they had to behave like men and to be more manly than men. And I think one of the changes that I saw in my time, and I worked for 32 years at the BBC, so I saw a lot of changes. That kind of tough version of female involvement in broadcasting fortunately gave way as more and more women did get into the corporation and elsewhere in the industry. and didn't feel they had to be like that. Because some of the women in charge were unheard of. I do know that quite senior people used to be terrified of some of the women. There was a producer, an editor of a popular program who was very, very angry that she wasn't promoted to a particular job, and she was haranguing the executive who had made it, and he literally locked himself into his own office because he was so frightened of this woman who was a harridan of the first water, really.
But do you think women to succeed in the BBC had to be, quotes, difficult, unquotes?
Yes, I do think they felt they had to be. And if I talk about the gentler side of women, it sounds like I'm trying to invoke a sort of femininity of Victorian type or something. But there are plenty of men who were nasty and bullying and obnoxious, and was not necessary. There are lots of decent men, kind, gentle men, and it became more and more possible for women to also be of that ilk. And it's not invoking some sort of notion of Victorian femininity of gentle womenfolk. It's that there's a range of behaviour which it becomes possible. And I think the early generation of women, it would have been really, really difficult to be kind and gentle, because that would be, it's weakness. The women are weak. And I think that's one of the great improvements, that there are plenty of executives now that I know who are just sort of normal human beings, if you like. One of the union campaigns that we fought was to have a wider range of people coming in for special production training courses. There was all white, all male, awful lot from Oxbridge. And we did, working together with, to be fair, with people in what was then called personnel, would now be called HR, to widen the range of people coming in. I remember Glyn Price, for example, who was a very progressive person. He was excellent. He agreed with us on that and tried to widen the range coming in. Coming back to my own career, I'd studied history at university and got a rather mediocre degree, because I used to edit the student newspaper, and I used to do a lot of drama stuff and so on, and played football. I hadn't thought of working in broadcasting or anything. I wanted to write. I wanted to write a history of the blues, which I did, working for the BBC, making a series on the history of the blues and publishing a book alongside. And I'm proud to say that book is still in print 45 years later. So it just shows you.
Of course, in those days, people working in education departments had to edit or produce books. And that was quite an interesting discipline, also quite a load to expect people to carry. And of course, it was staff no fee. I don't know if you managed to get any money out of
yes, I got royalties.
Oh, did you?
Which helped buy my house.
Golly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
But I was told I was the last member of staff to get royalties because produced a series about something or other and had an accompanying book. Each chapter in the book had been written by a different researcher working to, and he just lifted all their work wholesale, didn't write anything himself. He got royalties for the book, and the staff protested. So the solution to that potential problem was to stop having royalties going to staff, and I was the last one.
Now, tell me a bit more about community programs. It wasn't just community programs, it was community and disability.
Yeah, there was, there'd always been some broadcasting for disabled people. Does He Take Sugar? Disability program unit was staffed with people who were disabled people who were being trained to work in television. There was some funding from the EU, and with certain funding agreed by Will Wyatt, who was their managing director of television. Mm-hmm. And there were programs, there was a magazine program, and the documentaries. So we had support staff for helping people with more severe disabilities. And there was an editor, or overall editor of the DPU, and we won quite a few awards actually for...
This was pioneering, I imagine.
Yes, this was in the 1990s. Sadly, the BBC decided to disband it all after a few years, after my time, which I thought was pretty shocking. They effectively dismantled community programmes as well. Community programmes created the genre of video diaries, where people were trained in the use of camcorders and recording their own lives, which they were then helped to edit under their editorial control. After Video Diaries, there was Video Nation, which was the best known element of that, was kind of 2-minute snippets of life before Newsnight at 10:30 in the evening. And over 1,000 of these 2-minute things were done. Political opinions, lifestyle things, humorous, sad, moving, irritating, the whole range of human experience. It was a project where at any given time there were 50 or so people had camcorders, would record whatever they wanted in their own lives, but also would be sometimes asked to do something on a certain subject. And I remember it was very interesting. People thought that the coverage of the Princess Diana death had been mawkish and created by the media. Our Video Nation people, there was just from day one, there was a huge torrent of stuff from people wanting to comment on her and her life and her death. It was not all got up by the media. The media may have amplified it, but it was a real phenomenon. People cared about her and felt very passionately about her. I remember there was a gay man who sent in a very touching thing about how he felt she had been tolerant and had involved people who,
the AIDS campaign,
campaign. So it was interesting. We did, in the run-up to the 1997 general election, we did a series in the weeks running up to it, including on the night of the actual vote. And I thought that was terrific. We called it Nation Goes to the Polls, or something like that. I think we caught the flavour of what was going on in the country, that there really was a sea change of attitudes. Linked, as it happens, I think, to the Diana death. I think they were both part of the same phenomenon. The landslide for the Tony Blair government was part of the same process of rejecting the past. And it's interesting to see Sir Keir Starmer now praising the achievements of the Blair-Brown government.
There are more things I'd like to know about that unit. Firstly, it must have pioneered the use of the lightweight cameras that were coming in. Very primitive early ones, presumably.
Yes. Video diaries was one of the big sort of game changers in documentary. It gave power to the people to represent their own lives in their own terms in a way that even Open Door and then Open Space, which was the successor programme, basically a half-hour documentary slot. Video diaries, the early diaries, were long and possibly one could say under-edited. They became more disciplined eventually. But they won lots of awards, BAFTAs and that sort of thing. And documentary could never be done quite the same again after that, because one had seen people in their own habitats, if I can put it that way, in a way that had not been shown even with the most sensitive of observational
Well, I was thinking of the Family series. That preceded?
Yes, it did.
So there were examples of that, but of course heavily editorialised by the BBC. Now, what was the editorial stance that the BBC took when you had a piece of what you might call citizen journalism?
The launch of Open Door was I think a 13-part series which was experimental, supported by David Attenborough, and fully supported actually by the BBC. There was some nervousness about handing over editorial control. And of course, handing over editorial control had to be within the constraints of it's not a license to libel people, it's not a license to come out with untruths. But in other respects, editorial control really was handed over to outsiders, and to enable them to express themselves, to have their own say in their own way, was the residing philosophy of the programme. Open Door expanded into open space, which had better budgets, shooting ratio closer to 8:1, compared with the early ratio of 3:1, which is really difficult. Almost impossible to make a decent film with that sort of shooting ratio. Some of the early programmes, for that reason, were really quite hilarious, because you had to use almost everything you'd shot, regardless of the quality. And there was some of the programmes people within the community programme unit remembered fondly. There was the talking crash helmet. There was an interview done with a guy. No one thought to get him to take his crash helmet off. So they also had a small presentation studio. And there was an open door which was done by the Chicken Liberation Front, and there were all these chickens in the studio under the lights, and as they were talking passionately about the need to sort of protecting chickens from the horrors of battery farming, and one by one the chickens in the studio are keeling over because of the heat from the lights. And they just carried on as though they were all sort of fine, just having a sleep.
So you had studio material as well as film?
Yes.
Interesting, yeah.
Very often you would just run the film through the studio gallery to put on captions and stuff like that.
Yes.
There was a kind of hierarchy of within the unit, the programmes, the more all film you could make them, the higher the quality was assumed to be, which was actually kind of in a way underusing the studio potential. It was in the old presentation Studio B, Pres B, where they used to do the old grey whistle test.
Yes, indeed. Late night lineup.
Yeah, and Late Night Lineup, who spawned Open Door. That's where it came out of. It was, oh God, what's his name? Who was the editor? I used to know the history so well, and
yes,
the old brain gives up after a while with all the knowledge that you accumulate.
And then it comes back. I have this idea for a series called It's on the Tip of My Tongue.
Brilliant, absolutely right. But
I just want to get this clear, this editorial control. Now, presumably you shot stuff, presumably the people who were involved in the subject matter of the programme were shooting it themselves, or were they directing cameramen? They could do if they wanted. There's a kind of ideal open door stroke open space where the participants would direct the cameras, but actually that happened relatively seldom. Very often people would be, supposing one was making a film, typically Oxfam, that would be at the top end of the sort of big name, well-known, nationally famous, etc., etc., etc. You might get a local campaign, say about, I don't know, water quality in their local neighbourhood. They wouldn't necessarily have the time or inclination to film direct themselves, but they would want it done on their behalf. And there you would agree the parameters of what you were going to film. Sometimes they would want to present themselves, sometimes not. So horses for courses, basically. A lot of people just wanted it to be under their editorial control. They wanted it as professional as possible and didn't want to interfere with that, but would view a rough cut, an assembly, and so on, all the way through to a fine cut, coming in to see it in the editing suite.
And that's really where the editorial control was most typically exercised, would be in the editing.
But presumably editors were quite influential when it came to...
And production staff. There were some producers in CPU who really took over and persuaded, to use the jargon of the place, the accessees, people who were being given access. The notion of access broadcasting is mainly from North America, both Canada and the United States, particularly in the more progressive areas like New York. There's a whole movement of public broadcasting in the States in particular.
PBS, presumably, yes.
Of access broadcasting. There were access stations in Bristol. There was an access station called Bristol Channel. There was another one in Greenwich, both of which, by chance, I worked on a series with the exciting title of Television and Society, produced by Howard Smith, who I worked with a lot. And I was extremely fond of him. He died a few years ago. We got on extremely well, and we filmed an access station in action, so I knew more about it than most people, because I'd done stuff about it before I joined the unit. And I will remember the name of the founding editor, who came from Lineup.
We could probably
Rowan Ayres. Rowan Ayres, who worked on Lineup, was the founding and experimental editor of Open Door, which was given an initial run of 13 programs. Purely as an experiment. It was not clear that it could work. There was the fear that handing over editorial control to other people in the general public would lead to a deterioration of standards, or they would be so outrageous and shocking and out of control that it would cause embarrassment to the BBC. If anything, that initial series was actually quite dull and a little bit worthy, a little bit safe, but it actually helped. People thought, oh yeah, it's all right, they're not going to go crazy, they'll be sensible, and it's a useful kind of public service provision to have, charities and people like that doing worthy programs. So it sort of took the heat off the thing, which then enabled much more challenging work later on. There's a program about racism in the BBC, which had a lot of extracts from a debate which Robin Day had chaired, involving Enoch Powell.
Oh, yes.
Rivers of Blood, Enoch Powell. And it was as though Robin Day kept on turning to Powell, saying, as though he was some sort of umpire about these things. It was an extraordinarily racist program, I must say. Anyway, this Open Door, made by the Campaign Against Racism in the Media, which exposed that program to scrutiny. One of the people doing that was Professor Stuart Hall, who is one of the great sociologists, political analysts. I knew him well. I worked with him on 2 or 3 things, both inside the BBC and outside. He contributed to a book that I helped edit. Lovely man. Anyway, he was one of the analysts of this output, and it was a devastating critique of Robin Day. Day protested to the BBC and said that he'd been libelled. Of course, the programme had been lawyered to the 10th degree, and he was not libelled, but typically, cravenly, there was a public apology on the BBC in the slot, which is normally occupied by Open Door, apologising for what it had implied about him, even though it was not libellous. It was accurate. It was fair.
But that probably diffused a lot of criticism that was perhaps mounting outside.
Yes.
I mean, often a public apology does that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether it would be craven, but it's an interesting fact that, in a sense, the editorial control is in the choice of the people that you cover in those programs.
Well, we used to have a selection meeting involving all the members of staff in the CPU. And then that was, some people found that a bit alarming and a bit too democratic, to having sort of PAs voting on what programs to do. But it endured for quite a long time until it was killed off. I forget which channel controller killed it off. He didn't want that. It was a BBC Two programme. I can't believe Alan Yentov would have killed it off. But anyway, it was. But we had outside advisors. Sometimes there were people, former accessees, again to use the jargon, people who'd made earlier open door or open space programs because they knew what was involved and what it was like, and to speak, as it were, for members of the public. There were other people from different walks of life. Hugo Young, who was a Guardian journalist, he was theoretically an outside advisor, but actually he never turned up to meetings, too busy. Oh, we had Day Lewis, lovely man, he was a very good advisor, he always came to meetings. He was the TV critic for the Daily Telegraph. And a name would be very familiar to you in educational broadcasting, John Kane. In retirement, he came back and was really, really good as an outside advisor, and was like a human heat shield, protecting the unit from pressure from people elsewhere in the BBC. He was a reassuring presence, trusted by the BBC because he'd been at a very senior level.
He also, of course, was the BBC historian for a while, but then he got dementia or something like that.
He did, very sadly.
Yeah. What are your most memorable programmes?
The thing in a way I'm most proud of was The Devil's Music, which was the history of the blues. Partly because I was then only a trainee assistant producer. I hadn't directed anything at that stage. I was basically a researcher. It was my idea to do the series, my insistence that only black people, African Americans, should appear in it. I did not want white experts explaining the music. I wanted them, the contributors themselves, to speak in their own way. In some respects, it's a philosophy that was suitable for my later working in the community program unit. I interviewed a whole range of... We filmed in Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, Memphis, St. Louis, Chicago, New York. Because I was so inexperienced and never directed anything, I was put under the charge of Madeleine Fagandini, a very experienced producer, who was wonderful. I couldn't have had... It was a really, really good choice. She knew nothing about the blues, but knew a lot about music. Her father was a musician in cabarets and clubs in London in the 20s, Italian. She was really experienced as a producer and a director. She was very supportive as a mentor. We always got on very well, and again, she was someone I could argue with. She welcomed debate and discussion and testing of ideas. So she was great. She was also it was really good having a white woman as part of a team talking to, in African American communities, almost exclusively talking and dealing with black people. Very disarming to have a white woman who was so polite and respectful and kind to the people we were, and I hope I was too. We definitely tried to do that. And we had a film crew that almost all of them had worked with Madeleine before, and we had discreetly checked out, were they happy to be filming in exclusively black communities? No problem at all, and they were all great. Madeleine had chose them extremely well.
These were American crews, or did you use the BBC crews?
BBC crew. I don't know if you know John Turner, who was he had been a newsreel cameraman during the Second World War, which I didn't know until after I'd worked with him. If I'd known, I'd have asked him about stuff like that.
It's very good series to have worked on.
It reminds me, there was a story, and apparently the Queen laughed at this story, that the BBC has those kind of meeting and greeting, the sort of great and the good, and that you would be expected to sort of sing for your supper, meeting them and drinking wine and so on. when I was working on the series about the history of the blues, I was at one of these meet and greet sessions, and I was talking to this woman, and she said, which was rather snooty, she said, and what are you working on? And I said, well, I'm working on a history of the blues. And she said, oh, how marvellous. That was my husband's regiment.
I could ask you what your worst moments are. Well, I will. Got any worst moments? It's always interesting to have worst moments.
Not so much individual programmes, but worst. When, as part of the reorganisation of the BBC under Bert, ultimately, though it wasn't intended that way, I think, by Bert himself, but the community programme unit was disbanded. I was removed as head, and there was a huge public outcry, genuinely. The governors intervened, they tried to stop the disbanding, and there was a kind of token presence that survived, the cull. It's a complicated story, what happened to community programme unit under my headship. It expanded to its greatest extent, so we had 100, 110 people sort of in the department, and it was a full department, it was no longer a unit. We had more hours of broadcasting than ever before, more formats, more output. So at its very peak, it was then killed off, and there was so many protests, but there was a senior person in the overall production who was clearly hostile. He was known to regard the Community Programme Unit, or CPU, as the communist programme unit, which was just stupid and ignorant and unworthy. It was not a communist party thing, it wasn't political in that way at all. Of course, there were times when left-wing people made programmes with us, or we made programmes with them, rather. Of course, that was the case, but for many of the years of the CPU's existence, which was from 1972 to, it was sort of killed off in the late 90s and 1990s. When there was ever more savings being sought, we had cuts. In the 5 years I was head of department, our budgets in real terms were cut by 50%. It's incredibly difficult to maintain quality when your output has been cut so savagely.
So do you think quality was suffering, and that was possibly the driving force behind closing you down?
Well, this is why the senior manager who took against me, I tried to argue with him about the way the cuts were impacting on us unfairly. And it was not a diminution of quality. We were still being commissioned by the channel controllers at the same level and more, which shows that we were editorially still. Mark Thompson, who was controller of BBC Two at this time, said that the quality control in my department was better than anywhere else in the BBC. And he thanked me for that, and he fought against the cuts. So it was not a loss of quality, but the wear and tear on staff to maintain quality with reduced budgets. That's what was unfair. And it was as though I was still a union person protesting the hours being worked by people and people not being able to take leave because they were wanting to finish off programmes, and the levels of exhaustion. The number of times I'd find staff in tears of exhaustion. It was awful, and I protested about it as a manager. And the senior executive did not like it. I said, you should be doing more to protect people. They're working their guts out for the BBC, and it's unsustainable. These people are going to make them ill. The hours they're working to achieve and still high standards editorially. We're still getting commission. You can't say we're not doing the job. But the wear and tear is just unfair.
You were still getting viewing figures. You were still getting appreciation and indexes.
The old AI.
And these were
all still high, and an enormous amount of press coverage, absolutely enormous. That's where there were people in the press that were trying to help us and help me personally. They thought, and I agreed, that the killing off, because of the fight back and the protests and other people. I remember the editor of World in Action. He protested to the BBC because he knew me because I had interviewed him.
Ray Fitzwalter.
Ray Fitzwalter, yeah, he protested. He sent me a lovely letter. I'd interviewed him I'd done a series with Bernard Adams called Whistleblowers about investigative journalism. I'd interviewed Ray Fitzwalter, and ever after he followed my career, and he sent me such a nice letter when he read in the press that my job had gone. My job had gone, and I was going to leave the BBC, and because of the hoo-ha it was created, and because the governors were saying this, you must stop this. So I lost my job, but the unit survived, but only for another couple of years.
So the governors were on your side as well,
yeah.
And yet you still felt you had to go.
And Uri Geller was on my side too. We'd done a programme with him, which was...
The spoons.
Yes.
But I was just thinking generally, the BAME issue, I always think that the BBC actually is really rather good in terms of its employment of on-air presenters and so on.
I think that's improved enormously.
Yes, less so possibly in production. But what's your experience in terms of...
Well, I will boast. When I was head of community and disability programmes, our employment profile was the best in the BBC. I remember
for ethnic minorities or for women or both.
For general.
Yeah.
There were 2 executive producers who were women, 2 who were men. If you take religion, we had obviously Church of England, Roman Catholic, we had Greek Orthodox, we had Hindu, we had Muslim, we had Sikh, we had atheists.
Yes, don't forget the atheists.
What's the phrase? All faiths and none. We had African, we had African Caribbean, African American. We had Indian, we had Pakistani. Yeah, we had a sort of a very, very good profile. Around about 25% were identifiable as ethnic minority, which is better than anyone else. And I used to get sort of invited to equal opportunities type things. What is the secret of your success? I'd just say employ people on the basis of their merits as producers or potential producers. Yes. And they say, well, how do you tell? Well, it becomes the opposite of a vicious circle. If you have programs which are made by and with black people, to loosely describe them, that will attract interest from others from those same communities. We did a lot of programming from across a wide range of people in the general public. That attracts people. You take ideas from those people. You get people coming to see you, asking you about your work. The success of CPU, which was often under fire all the way through the 70s and 80s, all the time, that was certainly the case. But there were times when the BBC was only too pleased to have us. When the Berlin Wall fell and the communist bloc collapsed, there were people who were coming from the newly democratic nations who would be pointed in our direction. I remember seeing delegations from Russian television, from Polish. The Poles came to London to kind of check out the BBC and how democratic broadcasting was done. They were directed towards news, and they said, no, we don't want to see news. We want to see community programmes. So we saw a Polish delegation.
I'm still mystified as to why it should have been demolished completely, or was it not demolished completely? Is there a rump, or is it merely assumed that it's now absorbed in general broadcasting?
Well, they certainly couldn't claim to be doing access broadcasting. By 2000, it had all gone. The executive producers who I'd appointed were still there, but there was no department, there was no unit anymore. It was just what work they could get commissioned, and as channel controllers changed and their taste changed. It just evaporated, really. There's nothing left of it. It lasted from 72 basically to 2000.
I'm just wondering whether partly it's that television production styles have become too glossy and too polished and too much dominated by the way that editors want to do things.
Also fast cutting.
Fast cutting, yes,
I remember
exactly.
reading a study which showed that the rate of shot change in programmes in the 1980s was something or other, I forget what the figure was, but the ratio of shots per minute or whatever hugely speeded up by...
It's now 4 seconds average time between shots.
Have I got any short, sharp, bad experiences? But this is a bad experience. I was head of community programmes, and the British Council invited me to go to Brazil to showcase our work of community programmes. Channel 4 had someone who was representing the whole of their channel for Channel 4. I had just my unit's output. But we had wonderful times. We went to 3 different cities in Brazil, showed complete programmes, discussed, had public sort of conferences and all the rest of it. It was all regarded as highly successful. The British Council were extremely grateful for my input and so on and so forth. And I go back home after, I think it was 3 weeks away. A great gig to get. I go back home. The unit had already been half absorbed into the documentaries department, but only managerially, not editorially. I go back and I'm summoned by the head of documentaries, and I think, he wants to hear about my trip to Brazil. And he said, no, don't talk about that. We need to talk about your future. We are pensioning you off. You'll get a good pension, but we're pensioning you off. And I said, well, you personally are pensioning me. I've been at the BBC, would have been then 29 years, and you're just pensioning me off. What have I done? What's my unit done? I've won X number of awards. How the hell is this? And I said, I'm not accepting this from you. It'll have to be someone a bit more senior than you telling me I'm being pensioned off. And I walked out slamming the door.
God.
He then contacted HR and said, old Giles is not at all happy. He slammed the door and walked out on me. And I insisted that I should be allowed to speak to, as it happened, the senior person who shall have no name. And it was something like 6 weeks before I could actually get to meet him. And he was very grudging when I finally did meet him, but I disarmed him. I'd heard that his wife had been ill, and I said, I'm so sorry to hear that your wife has been ill. It must have been very difficult running BBC in circumstances like that. I'm really, really sorry to hear about that. And that completely threw him. He didn't know quite what to say.
Did you keep the job?
Having despised me, I think, and I think he really did despise me. And because he had no feel at all for community programmes, just absolutely everything that he disliked about us, he heaped on to me in his attitude. Having seen, I think he thought I'd sort of outflanked him, and I think he respected that. And I think he thereafter felt obliged to find something that was suitable to, a head of department equivalent sort of job elsewhere. I was offered 6 or 7 jobs, which I all turned down, and I was going to become a professor at the university. And then I was offered a gig which I really, really wanted to do, which was to work on the BBC's Millennium Night show. It ended up, it was going to be 8 hours it was 26 and a half hours live broadcasting, and I worked all the way through. It's the only live programme I ever did, and I loved it. I wish I'd done more, because I think I was very good at it.
Yes.
In fact, there was one of our directors, that we had 60 locations that I was responsible for. We had staff from all around the world, all sharing stuff. So, whatever we did was available to any other country. And it was a fantastically interesting thing to do, going around the UK. I was responsible for everything in the nations and regions, to use BBC terminology. In other words, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, English regions, except for the Dome in London and except for the stuff on the River Thames, all the fireworks, which was one exec for the Dome, one exec for the River of Fire, another exec for the rest of the UK.
And you were the exec for the UK.
And I went all around sort of every single region we visited, and I had such fun.
So you were setting things up. So on the night.
So on
what
the
happened?
night,
Yes.
yeah, I was in the gallery for the UK. There was another gallery for foreign stuff and another gallery for what was actually finally transmitted. So we had so many locations, we were sort of shunting them in and out of. And I just loved it, absolutely loved it, especially when things went wrong. So there were we, sort of the seniors in the gallery, and there was one of the actual button pushers. He said afterwards, every time I looked round to see you were smiling. I just thought it's nice. Great. Yes. So that was one of the happiest times. And I worked with a woman called Avril McCrory, who had been head of classical music. She was the head of the whole project. Avril and I always seemed to end up together. I always got on well with her, so I wanted to work with her. So much to the BBC's relief, they could tell the world, we have not destroyed poor old Giles Oakley's career. We've found something that he wants to do. He's very happy, and he's going to be doing the Millennium Night.
Yes. That must have been extraordinary, a bit like a general election in a sense, going on for a long time.
I'm told it was the longest live programme the BBC ever did, apart from live coverage like of the Moon, which I think they continuously hopped in and out of all the way through.
Yes, I remember.
Whether it really was the longest, I don't know. Yeah. But I had fantastic fun doing it.
Now, I'm particularly interested in your work with it was with music and arts, was it?
Well, classical music, I think.
Yes. So was that Peter Manura's time, or was that before?
Yeah, he was head then.
Right. So tell me about working for them.
I had retired early from the BBC, and then I came back in as a contract person, as an executive producer. We did a Tchaikovsky season for which we recorded performance of Swan Lake, the ballet, and the opera Queen of Spades in the Mariinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg in Russia. So my last gig for the BBC was really rather wonderful for a month, more than a month I think actually, in St. Petersburg, and having the run of the Mariinsky Theatre, which was absolutely fascinating, but may have given me TB.
Oh no!
Yeah. The conditions of working in the Mariinsky Theatre were pretty primitive, I have to say. A lot of stuff from the Tsar's era and very small offices. And I became very ill not that long after.
Oh, really?
And had a series of chest infections over the next 18 months. And eventually I was referred to a consultant at Queen Mary's Hospital in London, and they said, "Did you know you had TB?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well," she showed me the X-ray, the damage done to my lungs.
It's true.
And she said, "Your immune system is very strong, and it has dealt with your TB, but at a cost. Your lungs are permanently damaged." And we discussed where I could have been infected. And she said, taking account of what I'd been doing, she said, "Probably in Russia. TB is rampant in Russia, and it thrives in hot, damp conditions," which is what we had a temporary gallery in one of the offices at the back of the stage. And we were all in there. We had to have extractor fans to take the humidity out of it. absolutely perfect conditions for spreading of TB, apparently. So that's where I probably got it.
But you were under contract to the BBC. Yeah. Did they take any responsibility for that at all?
No, I should have done, really, because the working conditions would have been unacceptable. With my union hat, I was thinking, should I really take it? And I must say, I thought, no, I'm not going to fight this one. But the conditions were pretty gross. We were all dripping with sweat the whole time. You could tell a lot of the workers, scenery people and so on and so forth, their canteen was tiny and was sort of all cheek by jowl. You could see how an illness which spreads in humid conditions, why it would be so widespread in Russia.
Giles, just when you came to leave the BBC, was this with regret?
When I left the BBC, it was with regret in the sense that I was going to miss the camaraderie of broadcasting. I used to love the cutting room. I used to love being on the road with the film crew. I used to love doing OBs. That was great. You'd have a laugh. When I was working on The Devil's Music, we were filming in St. Louis, and a friend of mine who was an assistant professor in a University of Missouri, I invited her over. I got, agreement for this with the crew and my producer, for this friend to come and watch us, because she was fascinated. And she didn't know we were filming about the history of the blues. She knew nothing about the blues, but I asked her, what did you make of it when you saw us filming? I asked her this more than 40 years after. And she said, I'll never forget it. She said, I laughed a lot and I learnt a lot. And I thought it was lovely. That, to me, sums up my career in the BBC. I laughed a lot and I learnt a lot.
Yes. Giles, thank you so much for doing this. Very interesting.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for asking me questions.